Hi, I'm Mike Lee, the author of Our Lost Constitution. In my next installment in my series of video segments leading up to Constitution Day, I thought I'd talk tonight for a few minutes about Chapter 7 of my book, Our Lost Constitution. In Chapter 7, I talk a little bit about the Second Amendment. Chapter 7 is the first in a series of chapters in a part of the book where I talk about what people can do to restore the lost Constitution. In Chapter 7, I use the Second Amendment as an example of how citizens have been able to help restore provisions of our lost Constitution by fighting in the courts. That's exactly what an American hero named Dick Heller did. Dick Heller was a police officer. Interestingly enough, he was living in the District of Columbia at a time when the District of Columbia basically didn't allow anyone to buy or own or possess guns. You just couldn't have them. Now, Dick Heller could have one while he was at work because he was a police officer. He was a specialized type of police officer. And he lived in the District of Columbia. He lived in an area where there was a lot of crime. He was disturbed by the fact that he was surrounded by criminal activity, sometimes in his neighborhood, and yet there seemed to be nothing he could do about it. Sometimes the police got there in time to respond to a crime. Sometimes the police didn't. So he decided that he wanted to have a gun. He went down and he applied for a permit to have a gun. The permit was denied pursuant to a D.C. city ordinance. He knew that would be the case. He knew it would almost certainly be the case because the law in place in the District of Columbia made it almost impossible for a private citizen to own and possess a firearm as a private citizen. But Dick Heller, you see, was not someone who was content with just letting his constitutional rights go unaddressed. He was not someone who was content with simply allowing someone else to decide his fate, especially when he realized that there is something in the Constitution that entitles all Americans to protections in the right to bear arms. And that is the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. This is an important provision, and it's one that I think is often mischaracterized and far too often maligned. And believe it or not, prior to just a few years ago, really, it's been in the last decade that the Second Amendment has been reinvigorated because for a long time people assumed it was dead. Too many scholars, unfortunately with the assistance of some jurists, including with the assistance of U.S. Supreme Court Justice McReynolds and late Chief Justice Burger, had made some comments sort of causing a lot of people to just assume that the Second Amendment was dead letter law. They assumed, or sometimes they asserted, and other people believed, perhaps because they wanted to believe, that the Second Amendment didn't in fact create an individual right, that it instead just acknowledged the existence of state militias, and that the Second Amendment was there really only to recognize that this right could be exercised only collectively by state militias. Well, of course, this isn't true. Dick Heller knew it not to be true. And Dick Heller also understood something, that in addition to the fact that this is already in the language of the Constitution itself, Dick Heller understood that this is important to people on the basis of their own individual freedom, their inherent God-given right to self-preservation, that this be an individual right. He knew that the Founding Fathers, on some level, he knew that the Founding Fathers understood this, and that's why they put the Second Amendment in place. And you see, this history goes back, Dick Heller started this battle in the early 2000s. He didn't win it for several years after that. Like I say, this has been apparent. This has been overtly recognized as an individual constitutional right for only less than about the last decade. It's been less than 10 years since the case United States versus Heller was decided. But this struggle goes back much further than that. In fact, the origins of this right can be found in the 70s. And by the 70s, I don't mean the 1970s, and I don't mean the 1870s. I don't even mean the 1770s. I'm talking about the 1670s. A lot of this started in England when you had King Charles I, who decided to crack down on the right to bear arms. It cracked down on gun ownership and possession in England. In particular, Charles I had been deposed. He had been beheaded Charles II was trying to cling to power, and he wanted to make sure that his enemies stayed in their proper lane. And he wanted to make sure that those who didn't agree with him religiously, which was most of the country, Protestants, were kept in line. And so he put in place legislation making sure that his opponents, religiously and politically, could not possess firearms. He did it in the name of regulation of hunting, interestingly enough. But the law that he put in place effectively banned most members of the public, almost everyone, from owning or possessing or using firearms. This got worse in the years that followed. When James II came into power, he pushed this even further by having those who administered his government enforce the law very aggressively. They would knock down doors, conducting these rampant searches and seizures of firearms so that no one could gain access to weapons. Why? Well, because people who had access to weapons could defend themselves, and people who could defend themselves were thought of as threats to the king, threats to the government, and they couldn't have that. They couldn't have the people being in a position to defend themselves, and so they wanted to just seize all the firearms. Well, this didn't go over so well with the people. And by 1688, the people of Great Britain had had enough. And it came about that the Glorious Revolution took place in 1688 with William and Mary. Mary, an heiress to the throne in her own right, and her Dutch husband William came to power. And when they came to power, they brought about, in connection with the Glorious Revolution, this expansion of powers, this recognition of the right of human beings to live and to be free. And they put in place in English law the rights of individual Englishmen to possess and bear firearms so that they could act in their own defense. This was big. This was huge. This was powerful. This was a kingdom that was now recognizing the rights of Englishmen to be free, to defend themselves. They recognized in their own way the dignity of the individual human soul. So this was in place for a long time. These rights were still intact when the American colonies went from being sort of a child to a muscular teenager, and as the colonists increased in number and increased in wealth, in political clout, eventually this started to make the crown nervous, to the point where King George III, in the moments leading up to the American Revolution, in some ways prompting the American Revolution, King George III took a page out of the playbooks of James II and of Charles II, and they started restricting the right to bear arms. They started kicking down doors to take away people's guns. Not cool. Not cool at all. Especially in light of the fact that these are natural rights, and these were rights that had become part of the English Bill of Rights. The English Bill of Rights is a little different than ours, but it was a recognition of the fact that these rights existed. And our ancestors in English colonial America were Englishmen, and as such, they had these rights. So that's one of the reasons why the American colonists became fed up with King George III. It's one of the reasons why we ended up having a revolution. It's one of the reasons why we don't fly the Union Jack. It's one of the reasons why we no longer pay tribute to a monarch. It's one of the reasons why we became our own country. And for that reason, after we put the Constitution in place in 1787, after it was ratified a couple years later, by 1791, when it came time to put in place the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, which we now call the Bill of Rights, it naturally followed that the right to bear arms would be one of those first rights. And so that's why I'm talking about this one this evening, as we lead up to Constitution Day. I want to make very clear that this is an important right. And just as importantly, this is a great example of how the American people can take a provision of the Constitution, one that has been neglected, one that has been denied of its full vitality, and they can reinvigorate it when they assert their rights. They can make sure that those rights are not neglected. They are not lost. This is exactly what Dick Heller did. Dick Heller went out and he found some people who agreed with him. He found some outstanding lawyers who were willing to fight with him. And the fight took a long time. It took 5 or 6 years to complete. But at the end of that process, he got his permit. At the end of that process, the Supreme Court of the United States recognized that as an American citizen, Dick Heller has certain rights, and that among those rights is the right to bear arms, protected by the Second Amendment to the Constitution. It's a great example of how we are not a group of people who can be expected to just neglect our rights. As long as we're willing to assert them, those rights can be recognized, they can be restored even when they've been lost. This reminds me of a story that I've sometimes told about when I first arrived in the United States Senate. It was kind of interesting. When I first got to the Senate, I was the youngest member of the Senate at the time. I was 39 years old. According to some here, I didn't look like a senator. I think I still had a little bit more hair then. This was just a few years ago, but when I got here, some of the security guards didn't recognize me, and I found myself getting carded, for lack of a better word, every time I went to the Senate floor. Every time I was about to go vote, I would get carded. Now, I'm a non-drinking kid from Utah. I'm not used to getting carded. But every time this happened, they would ask for my ID. They didn't want to see my driver's license. No, they wanted to see my Senate identification. They'd look at me almost as if to say, look, the door for the interns is over there. And so I'd have to go through this elaborate process and pull out this card with my picture on it. It says United States Senator representing Utah. And then there's this eerie inscription at the bottom of it. It says expiration January 3rd, 2017. I had to explain to my wife and our 3 children who were concerned when they read that that's not the date when I personally will expire. That's just my term of office. But after I'd show them this card, and they'd sit there and examine it to make sure the tamper-resistant strip was intact. Apparently they were afraid that I had bought this thing at a fake ID outlet in Georgetown. They'd look at each other, shrug their shoulders, and say, well, I guess we have to let them in. Well, I went through this little exercise every single time I had to go vote in the Senate. And after I'd done this for a while, I mentioned it to one of my colleagues. I said, don't you think it's strange we get carded around here? My colleague looked at me and said, look, you must not be wearing your pin. I said, what pin? I said, well, didn't they give you a pin when you were sworn into office? And I said, yes, but I'm not really into jewelry and accessories. So I put the pin in a drawer and I closed the drawer and I forgot about it. He said, well, wear the pin. The cops on Capitol Hill will recognize you when you come to the door and you won't get carded anymore. And, I tried it out, and he was absolutely right. And I've worn that pin ever since then, whenever I've been in Washington. I'm wearing it right now. It's right here. This is a pin that's apparently worn only by U.S. senators. I've even named my pin. I call it my sorry senator pin because to this day, when they card me, I just point to the pin, and they say, oh, sorry, Senator, come on in. So I call it the sorry senator pin. Anyway, lame joke, but you get the idea. The pin's there. The pin works. It works flawlessly. Only one time after I'd been here almost a year, I was on the Senate floor and I realized the pin hadn't worked because one of the non-uniformed security guys on the Senate floor comes up to me in the middle of a couple of votes. And I had my arms gently resting on the desk in front of me. And the guy asked me, he comes up to me, he says, excuse me, sir, will you please not lean on the senator's desk? I said, oh, I'm terribly sorry. I didn't realize I was putting any pressure on it. You see, the desks in the Senate chamber, they're very old. Most of them are original equipment, which means they've been in continuous use for about 160 years, and which means they're almost as old as some of my colleagues. But so I said, I'm terribly sorry. I didn't realize I was putting any weight on it. And then he said, are you with the minority? We were the minority party at the time. And I said, what do you mean, on this vote or the next? I don't always vote with my party. Sometimes I do. Sometimes they get it wrong. He said, no, I'm not sure what you mean. And he said, are you with the minority leader? And I said, well, what do you mean? Mitch McConnell's our leader. I'm not sure what you're getting at. And he said, no, are you part of the minority leader's staff? Then I realized he had no idea who I was. So I dutifully pointed to the sorry senator pin, thinking that would be the end of the inquiry. And all it got me was a blank stare. So it got awkward at that moment, and I knew I was going to have to use my title. I didn't want to have to use my title. I didn't like using my title. I still don't to this day. It makes me feel queasy. So I kind of mumbled it. I said, I'm Senator Lee. And he didn't hear me. He said, what? And I said, okay, my name is Mike Lee. I represent a state called Utah, sort of squarish. It resembles a chair. It's in the Rocky Mountains, best snow on earth, lovely skiing. And at that point, he realized who I was, and he seemed kind of embarrassed, and he breathed out in one hurried sentence as all the color seemed to drain from his face. He said, "I'm terribly sorry for the misunderstanding. My name is Steve, if you want to report me," and then he ran for the door. Well, I felt bad for Steve. This was an honest mistake, so I tried to chase after him, but alas, Steve was too fast. But it was an honest mistake. So from then on, every time I passed Steve in the hall, I waved to him and I said, "Hi, Steve," just so, Steve knew there were no hard feelings. It was an honest, reasonable mistake. And it was quite a while before I realized his name's probably not Steve. Maybe Steve's a guy he works with who he doesn't like. Maybe that guy's name was really Bob. In any event, the reason I tell this story, it relates back to Chapter 7 of our Lost Constitution. It relates perfectly to the Second Amendment. The reason I tell that story is because of the fact that had I not asserted my right to be there that day, even though it was difficult, even though I had to use my title, I didn't want to use my title, because that required me to assert myself in a way that I was not comfortable asserting myself. But had I not been willing to do it that day, I might have found myself being hauled out of that chamber involuntarily by Steve, perhaps in handcuffs, perhaps while many of my colleagues watched, somewhat amused. They might have waited just a little while before telling the cops that I was actually a senator and I had every right to be there. The people I represent in my home state wouldn't have had me representing them that day. In order for that election certificate I have to mean something, in order for my Senate ID to mean anything, I have to be willing to assert the fact that I have it. And this story isn't limited to U.S. senators. It's not limited to people who hold public office. This story applies to every American, just by virtue of the fact that you exist, the fact that you hold U.S. citizenship, and that you reside on U.S. soil, the fact that you're here. Because every one of us has something. We have a whole lot of things, in fact, that are properly ours, which may become meaningless, may be rendered useless if we fail to assert them. We can't assert them unless we know what they are. Now, fortunately, thank heaven above, that Dick Heller, this American hero who resided in the District of Columbia as a police officer, thank heavens that Dick Heller wasn't willing to just disregard the fact that his rights were being infringed. Thank heaven that Dick Heller knew the Constitution, that he had read it, that he was willing to assert his rights, even when it was difficult, especially realizing that it was difficult, but he did it anyway. This is a success story. Now, not every one of our constitutional rights that's been diminished can always be overcome in the courts. As I explain in my book, Our Lost Constitution, there are a whole lot of reasons why, in some cases, the courts might refuse to hear a particular case, or in other instances, the courts might lack jurisdiction to hear about a particular infringement of the Constitution. But in some cases, it works. And we've got to realize that the Constitution is there, that it has to be asserted. So I explain elsewhere in the book that, we have to continually assert our rights, sometimes in court, sometimes in arguments before the executive branch, and many times, far more than happens in many instances today, we need to assert our constitutional rights even before the legislative branch, especially in front of the legislative branch. The legislative branch needs to start following the Constitution, needs to apply the Constitution, separate and apart from whatever it thinks it can get away with in court. You see, the fact that there are a lot of instances in which the courts aren't willing to enforce the Constitution doesn't mean the Constitution doesn't exist, any more than the fact that you maybe didn't get a traffic ticket today necessarily means that you didn't commit some type of traffic infraction. Doesn't mean that you were abiding fully by the speed limit just because you didn't get a ticket. So too with Congress. The fact that Congress passes a whole lot of laws, most of which are never touched by the Supreme Court, or by any court for that matter, doesn't mean that Congress is following the Constitution. Now, what makes the difference? The people. The people have the power. The people have the power, especially when, really only when, they're willing to read the Constitution, when they're willing to know what's in here, when they're willing to assert it when it's difficult. That's when the magic happens. That's when we make sure that our constitutional rights really mean something. That's why I wrote Our Lost Constitution. I want to make sure that every American is aware of as many provisions of the Constitution as possible that have been neglected, that have been diminished, that have been dismissed, that have been lost, as I put it in our book. Now, my book doesn't cover every one of these. It would probably be impossible to do that in one sitting. But my book, Our Lost Constitution, does discuss a whole lot of them, and it's a good place to start. If you haven't read it yet, I'd encourage you to pick up a copy. Find a friend or a neighbor who has one. You can find it at your library, or if all else fails, you can probably even buy it somewhere. But more importantly, I want you to read the Constitution. I want you to know what's in it. I want you to know what's there so that you can assert your rights as an American citizen. Together we can do this. Look, restoring our lost Constitution is no more difficult than establishing our great republic was a couple of centuries ago. It's no more difficult than drafting the Constitution from whole cloth, creating something out of nothing. In fact, it's far easier. It's there. The answers are there. We just have to be willing to do the work to find them and to assert them continually. I invite all within the sound of my voice to join me in this cause to help restore our lost Constitution. Thank you very much for joining me this evening. May God bless the United States of America.